So it looks like the father of Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi, is not done with game development just yet, as he recently announced that he's going to be working on a brand new dark fantasy title. And to make things even sweeter, he's going to be having Nobuo Uematsu join him to compose some of the songs for that game's soundtrack. So we're going to take a look at this in today's video, and if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here and you'd like to stick around, you can subscribe, and also leave your thoughts in the comments down below. So Hironobu Sakaguchi is someone who makes the rounds pretty consistently when it comes to the gaming news sphere. Whenever Final Fantasy is mentioned, his name is always brought up because he is the creator of Final Fantasy. He's even taken part in some really great roundtable discussions on the franchise, specifically with 7 Remake and 7 Rebirth. He's given his 2 cents on a Final Fantasy VI remake, so he's always in the vicinity of the gaming conversation somewhere, and most recently, he was in the news for Fantasian Neo Dimension and promoting that game. Just to give a quick rundown on what that is, it is a game that he created with his development studio Mistwalker that initially only released through Apple Arcade. So if you didn't have an Apple device, you could not play Fantasian. But thanks to a recent partnership with Square Enix, seemingly spearheaded by Yoshi P, they were able to bring Fantasian out of the Apple Arcade ecosystem and now onto gaming consoles and PCs with a much bigger production value. But it seems like that experience and working on Fantasian Neo Dimension has kind of given Sakaguchi a second wind, and he has now announced that he's working on a new project. So this information comes to us from J-Wave radio show Tokyo Mad Spin, which is a Japanese radio station with an incredible name. I mean, I can hear the radio kind of personality saying this name already, a J-Wave radio show Tokyo Mad Spin. It's just so much fun to say. And also thank you to Genki over on Twitter who took the time to translate this interview and share that information with us. He's always consistently giving great gaming updates over on his Twitter, so I'll leave a link in the description to Genki's Twitter account for you guys to check out. But Genki goes on to write that Sakaguchi is currently working on a dark fantasy game with his Mistwalker studio, and that Uematsu has not retired and he will compose some songs for that game. Sakaguchi goes on to say, "Yes, I am working on a new title. Composing the full soundtrack is a bit difficult for Uematsu-san because it is quite physically exhausting, and he has concerts with his Kontiki band, but he will compose some songs for it." Genki also goes on to write that Sakaguchi also said he was thinking of retiring, but he really likes his staff and doesn't want to separate from them. So a brand new dark fantasy game, which I'm assuming is going to be very different from Fantasian Neo Dimension. Granted, I didn't play the original Fantasian. I do want to check out the Neo Dimension version, but just kind of visually, it looks like a much lighter kind of game. I'm sure the story is actually, probably on the darker side, but when my brain goes to dark fantasy, I tend to think of something like Final Fantasy 16, which is a bit of an anomaly because it is a dark fantasy game that leans way more heavily into character action than it does RPG. A lot of the RPG stuff in that game felt kind of like an afterthought, but the character action stuff I thought was really fun. But it has some really heavy Western vibes and influence with the dialogue, the way the characters look, the overall aesthetics of armor, and the world itself being very medieval dark fantasy. And even the beginning of the game, which I really loved, has that dark fantasy Game of Thrones kind of feel to it, which the developers really were trying to go for. You had these warring kingdoms in these dark rooms trying to make deals with one another, those backdoor shady deals. You had spies, political intrigue. It felt way more grounded. And I do know the irony of saying Final Fantasy 16 is grounded because it is a fantasy game with these gigantic iconic monsters fighting each other while, people are fighting on the ground with large chickens and magic catapults. But what I mean by that is that political intrigue, the spies, the blood, it felt way more of a grounded, realistic take on a Final Fantasy game while still including those fantasy elements. And I feel like that kind of disappears a little bit further into the game, especially when the big bad of Ultima is revealed. I think more of the fantasy element kind of takes over, but that's a completely different video. But it makes me excited to see what he could craft with a brand new dark fantasy game, and it really just kind of seems like his experience working not only on Fantasian, but Fantasian Neo Dimension in particular, through that partnership with Square Enix and Yoshi P, really just revitalized him. We covered a few interviews in the past where it really seems like Yoshi P and Sakaguchi have a really great rapport with one another, a really great friendship, and it's a friendship where the two people clearly really trust one another. And they're willing to take ideas from the other person and actually listen to them and incorporate them into the game. And Square Enix, again, stepping in to be the new publisher for this game, they've also added in a little bit more budget. They've added things like voice acting to the game, updated controls, updated graphics, different difficulty modes. They've been able to help assist the project and make it something more high quality than it initially was. And that's something that Sakaguchi mentioned in previous interviews, is that if you look at the backgrounds of Fantasian, they're all physical real-life backgrounds. He and his team created these physical dioramas that they then took pictures of in 4K and used those for the in-game backgrounds. But because of, Apple's limitations with file sizes, they had to downscale those 4K images into a 1080p image. But now that they're releasing on console and PC, they've got that Square Enix budget, they can now reuse the original 4K assets for those backgrounds and really just make the game look livelier and prettier, and just honestly probably maybe closer to the vision Sakaguchi initially had for that game. And I also mentioned Square Enix because in this interview, Sakaguchi, obviously, this is very early on. They probably haven't even really started proper development yet on what this game is going to be, but he doesn't mention a publisher. And I wouldn't be surprised if Square Enix actually steps in to become the publisher for this game. Again, like Fantasian Neo Dimension, they can come in and add more budget into this game to potentially make it look, sound, play even better than if it was just Sakaguchi, his team, and a smaller indie publisher. I'm not saying it would be on the level of a Final Fantasy game or something from Atlas, but a brand new IP entering this world could benefit from having a little bit of extra budget. I think another thing to take into consideration here too is what kind of game does this end up being, because it may not even be an RPG for all we know. Sure, he could put together an RPG that has turn-based mechanics. He can build upon the mechanics he has in Fantasian Neo Dimension, which kind of has that gimmick of how you aim your attacks. But for all we know, he could want to do a character action game. He might want to do a puzzle game, a medieval dark fantasy puzzle game from Sakaguchi. It could be a first-person shooter. We don't know what he's got going on in that brain of his, but it could be any number of things, which is pretty cool. And based on that interview, Sakaguchi, again, just kind of seems like someone who really likes his job. And for him to not want to retire from gaming and having one of those reasons be that he just really likes his development team is super sweet. In my eyes, he really cares about them. And I think when you have a boss that genuinely cares about their craft and the people that they work for, you end up producing some really great stuff. So I'm pretty excited to see what he could do with a brand new original IP that is in that dark fantasy kind of vibe. And again, to make things even better, Uematsu-san coming back on board to compose some of the game's tracks is, super exciting. This is a legendary composer. Again, I think the man is a musical genius. I put him up there with, classical music composers like Beethoven and Bach, Mozart. Maybe I'm being hyperbolic, but the man's music, the way his brain works when it comes to composing these tracks is just so fascinating to me. And to hear his take on whatever this game is going to be has me super excited. And again, as great as it would be to have Uematsu-san come in and compose an entire soundtrack, it's unfortunately just not possible anymore. He's getting older, he's got, health issues that he's been dealing with, and like Sakaguchi says, crafting a soundtrack for an entire video game is crazy difficult work. You look at the soundtrack for the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, there are 3 main composers working on those games' soundtracks. It's not just one individual, and 3 people on a project that's a lot of work for them to do, and they crafted an amazing soundtrack. So having Uematsu come back in, compose some songs, while still allowing him to do other projects that he wants to pursue outside of gaming, which he talked about, I think is a really great kind of balance for him. And again, he's not retiring. That information was taken out of context. He's not doing the full soundtracks anymore. He's still going to work on music here and there for gaming, but he really wants to pursue things outside of the world of gaming. And like I mentioned in previous videos, any project that is lucky enough to have Uematsu on board to compose 1, 2, 3, 4 of their songs is incredibly lucky. So with that being said, that is the video. I am Curious Corduroy. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you think this next project from Sakaguchi is going to be? What are you hoping it's going to be? And do you think it could potentially be like a AAA title, or maybe something a little bit smaller in the vein of Fantasian Neo Dimension? I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.